Fellow humans, and welcome to Human Hour. I had a few issues with my screen recording last week, so I'm just redoing this tutorial for you guys. This is an example on creating pixel art and creating art specifically for a generative collection. I'm going to show you a few techniques that apply to pixel art in general, but mostly this will be done inside Photoshop, which isn't necessarily the program everyone uses, but it's just what I know and what I love. And I'd like to share with you some of the tools and techniques I use. Some of the techniques and some of the things I'll show you are applicable across all programs, but some of them also won't be. This is very much a layer-based tutorial, and I'm just going to show you a lot of the tools you can use. The point with a lot of digital art is that you can do things in numerous ways, just like coding, and there is no right or wrong way. It's just about knowing the tools at your disposal and using them in the way you choose. I won't give you too much direction on the artistic side of things, more just on the technical side of things. So feel free to send me any messages after this if you have any questions, and I'll get started. So the first thing I'll show you is just the general setup for setting up your document for pixel art. First things first, you're creating a new document. And over here, as you can see, we've already got our pixel set to 64 by 64. One thing I'm going to do is go over to web, because web in general presets our document to what will be most ideal to be displayed on a digital screen as opposed to printing, and then also just on the internet in general to be more broadly applicable. So most of the collections you see that are generative PFP or relatively small pixel collections are either 16 by 16, which is very small, 32 by 32, which is more common, and then 64 by 64 is what we've used for full body. And then every now and then you'll see a slightly larger pixel density. Any more than 128 by 128, you're starting to get to a slightly higher resolution. And while it is still pixel art, it's a little bit more defined and a little bit more detailed, and kind of starts to veer away from the very simplistic pixel art that we've been going for. So yeah, let me get started. So basically we use a 64 by 64 pixel ratio. Resolution is at 72. 72 is what's native for screens. 72 dpi or pixel per inch is what's usually for a screen, and then 300 is for print, for standard print. Print can go as high as 600 or 900 depending on the quality of your printer, but in general 72 is perfectly adequate for screens. Our color mode is set to RGB. Background is up to you. I like to start with a white background. It's only because the checkered grid on the transparent background can be a little bit confusing at times. And then color profile, this is up to you. This is all about just getting a uniform look between the different screens you use and the different devices you use. When outputting for web and for other people and for websites, I tend to use sRGB, which is a pretty broad spectrum RGB that's used by most people and is a pretty standardized display, so you get a pretty good feeling of what you're seeing is what other people are going to see. Whereas if you choose a color profile that's quite different, when you output it and someone else opens it, you could end up getting a slightly different look. So sRGB here is a pretty standardized format that people use. Square pixels down at the bottom, and that's our document setup. So now when we create that document, it's going to give you a nice little square. And I'm just going to jump over to the pixel tutorial I've set up with a few pre-made layers in case we need to jump to those. Okay, so right now we've got a transparent background. We can see our checkered grid, and if we click here, we're turning on our white background layer. Just quickly as an example, I'll show you here. We can view our grids, and we can have a pixel grid if we want to. Interesting. No pixel grid there. Doesn't matter. Moving on. So one of the more common tools that people tend to use in Photoshop is the brush tool. And over here on the side, you will see the brush tool. So this is what will be most common in normal art. I'm going to open up a fresh layer just to draw on. And when using the brush tool, you'll see we get this hazed effect around the brush. Now, well, this is great for most digital painting and most use in Photoshop, because hard edges with their aliasing isn't usually ideal for high resolution images. But while we're working in our pixel art, it'll be nice to have a hard square and a solid box. So instead of using the brush tool, we're actually going to hold down the brush tool here and choose the pencil tool. A shortcut for the brush tool is B, and by holding down Shift and pressing B, we cycle through the different brush tools. It's a nice little shortcut, but we're going to be on the pencil tool most of the time. Up here, you can see our opacity is set to 10%, and I'm going to change that opacity to 100%. And I'm going to do that by using the numerical shortcuts on my keyboard. So by pressing 4, you have an opacity of 40%. By pressing 8, 80%. And when you press 0, you've got an opacity of 100%. And now you can see when you draw, you get a much more definitive, hard line. You're filling in pixels exactly where they are and completely with the color you're using. So I tend to use the pencil tool only because it's just the most accurate in terms of working on such a zoomed in low res image. So I'm going to Control Option Z and just repeatedly press that until we go back and get rid of all of those. Okay, moving forwards. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create our base character, our base color, and our base outline. First thing we want to do is we're going to choose a basic skin tone to work off of. And down here in the bottom, you'll see your two available colors. By pressing X, you swap between your foreground and your background color that you're busy working on. And if you click on one of these colors, it'll bring up your color picker. So in our color picker, we're going to change our hue, and your hue is controlled by your scrolling bar here. And we'll find something that has a peach-ish tone. That'll be somewhere between the yellow and red. Now, once we've found that range, we're going to go up here. And as you move to the right, you'll increase your saturation and decrease your saturation to the left. As you go down, you'll get darker, and up, you'll get lighter. So you have a full range here of your color within the hue, and then you have your hue control on the side. If you have a specific color in mind, you can put in your HSB, your RGB, or your CMYK ratios in these boxes, and it'll jump to specifically the color you want. Otherwise, as you can see down here, if you know can't remember exactly what this is called, but if you know your color reference number, you can also put this in and it'll jump straight to that color. Okay, so let's find a peachish skin tone. I'm going to settle about there. I'm going to find something with a little bit of saturation, and I'll settle on that. Okay, so first things first, we're going to draw a little outline of a person. And like any art, you never need to be worried too much about your initial steps, because as you go, it's all a building process, especially when you're doing layer work. It'll always start off quite flat, and the goal is to slowly add detail as you move on and kind of be confident that you're moving towards your final product. One of the things we're going to be going through today is very much constructive editing. And one of the beauties of constructive editing is that everything is changeable as we move along. We are never permanently damaging our image, and our image is always adjustable layer by layer. So the first thing we're doing here is just drawing our base color with a solid 100% opacity. So we get our general shape of our figure down. And here we've got our figure. Now I can press E, and E jumps to the eraser tool over here, and I'll use the eraser tool to just clean up a few of the slightly messier pixels that I might want to just tone down a bit. Okay, switch back to the eraser tool. Okay, and now I'm gonna do some outlines. Before I move on to my outline layer, I'm gonna name my layer on the side here, and I'm gonna name my layer base skin tone. Next thing I'll do is I'll add a layer by clicking down here. Another way you can add a layer is Command-Shift-N, and by pressing Command-Shift-N, you'll get a pop-up that allows you to control the layer you're about to add. I might use that shortcut later, in which case when I do use shortcuts, I'll try and mention them and try first off explain what I'm going to do. So now that we have our new layer that we'll name Outlines, we can swap to a black brush. Down here you can see we still have our peach tone selected. I can either click in here and go down to black, or I can press the D button on my keypad. And by pressing D, we go to our default colors, which are black and white. So right now we're on black, our opacity is on 100%, we're on the eraser tool, press B, we'll jump to the brush tool, and we'll do our outline. Right now it's up to you whether your outline goes over your original base color, if it goes around it. It's not really important at this point. You have full control over your layers still, which is the beauty of constructive editing. I'll show you soon what destructive editing is and some of its disadvantages. One of the advantages of destructive editing is that your file size stays exponentially smaller because you're not dealing with multiple images on top of each other. And you also have the ability to change numerous aspects of your layer simultaneously. Okay, so this is a general idea of how you can draw your base character, but I'm going to jump ahead to a base character I've been working on for a while, and I'll use that as our sample for today. Okay, so I'm just going to remove this base and outline that we've just explained, dragging it to the dustbin there, and I'm going to bring in the two layers from earlier today. Basically, any new layers that we're working on will be below these dotted lines on the right-hand side in our layer panel. I'm going to go ahead and turn these layers on by clicking on the eyes. And at the moment, I have both layers selected as our working plane. And as you can see, it doesn't want to let me draw because you can't draw on two layers simultaneously. So as you select one layer, it'll once again give you an active working plane. Okay, so now that we have our human, we have his base tone, and we have his outlines, we're going to create a new layer. And our new layer, our first new layer will be a solid shadow layer. So let's go ahead and name this layer. We'll name it solid shadow. Now in order to get our shadow tone that we want to use, we're going to press I and go to the color picker or the eyedropper tool, and we're going to hover over our skin tone and click on it. And when we click on our skin tone, it's going to match that tone, and then we can go down here to our color picker. So right now it's on the current skin tone that we've just chosen, and we're going to want to make that a little bit darker in order to create a bit of a shadow. And to make that darker, we're just going to move down a little bit. And as you can see here on the side, it shows you your new color versus your previous color, and gives you a nice indication of how intense your shadow is you're about to create. We don't want to go too extreme, so we're going to just get a little bit of a shadow in there, something like that. Once we've chosen it, we'll click OK, and we'll go back to our brush tool by pressing B. Our opacity is on 100%. So now you can start off with drawing a simple shadow where you want the shadow on your human. I'm not going to tell you where to put it because that's your artistic kind of license there. So put it where you may, and I'll just draw in a little bit of a shadow on this human here. One thing to note is that because we are on 100% opacity, that anytime you draw over a previous part, it doesn't go any darker. So no matter how many times I click here on our previous color, that previous color is staying the same darkness because it is a solid color. Give our human some little pectorals. And once again, don't be afraid to make any mistakes. One of the things that's great about constructive editing is I'll show you how we can kind of work with those mistakes as we move forwards, and anything you don't like is always directly editable at a slightly later stage. So now I've just added a small amount of detail across our human to create some depth. Okay, now the next thing I'll do is I'm going to create a new layer, and I'm going to name that layer Opacity Highlights. Now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to add some highlights, only we're going to add our highlights with opacity. So down here on the left hand side, we'll change our color by pressing X. We'll swap our colors around, and now we're on white. So right now if we draw with this white, we're on solid white, and we're looking for a much softer look. So I'm going to undo that, and I'll change our opacity here down to 10%. This is the last time I'll use the slider bar, and from now on I'll be using the numerical keypad. So here on our human, I'll start drawing some highlights. Every now and then I'll be undoing some of my slightly smaller mistakes, and when I do, I'm using the Control-Z function. Right now the highlights I've drawn are quite light, and I'll turn my opacity up maybe to 20%. So now that my opacity is on 20%, I'm going to keep going. And one thing you'll notice is that now because we're working with an opacity layer, the opacity layer multiplies as you draw over it. So each time we click on an existing white area that we've already done, it's going to get lighter and lighter. So as you can see here, we've clicked a few times on this zone, and we've created a shine, and we've created quite a lot of variety in our tones here. Whereas here, using our solid colors, it's not really the same. We're putting down a flat color, and no matter how many times we go over it, it's staying flat. And I'll show you the benefits, the pros and cons, and some of the great things about that as we move forwards. I tend to work in a lot of opacity layers, but opacity layers, like many things, have their pros and cons. So I'm going to add a few highlights to our human before we move forwards. So now this layer we're adding is going to be fully adjustable. If it's too bright, if it's too intense, it's always something we can change at a later stage. And we're just going to put a few little highlights in just to create some added depth in our character. Okay, now that we've got that highlights layer, we're gonna add a new layer. And this new layer is going to be called Opacity Shadows. Now with Opacity Shadows, we're going to do a similar thing, only we're going to create a shadow layer using the same technique with opacity. So I'm going to press D and change back to our default colors. And I'm going to take our opacity down a bit lower, probably to somewhere around 5%. Black as an opacity tends to be a bit stronger than white, so that's why I've taken our opacity down a little bit. And now you can see as we draw, if we were to consecutively cross the same line, it gets darker and darker and darker. This is a pretty great way for creating tone, especially when you want to get a bit of detail and kind of 3D depth into your drawing. So I'm going to undo these little marks and I'm going to paint a bit of shadow onto our character. One thing you can do is each time you lift your mouse button and you click over and over again, it's going to make your area darker and darker. And if there's a certain zone you want to dramatically darken, you can just click away a few times and the multiplicating darkness there is going to do its job. Okay, so now that we've got a bit of depth into this character, we've got some solid shadows, we've got some opacity shadows and some opacity highlights. So before we move forwards, I'm just going to add some eyes and a mouth to this human, just to give him a bit of character so we can kind of see what we're working with. So let's add a new layer, and we'll call that layer eyes and mouth. I'm going to give him a little mouth. I'm going to press X, switch to white. I'm going to do the whites of his eyes. And then by pressing X, I'm going to jump back to black and give him some pupils. One thing I can do at this point is I can also go back to my opacity shadows, and I can add some shadows around his eyes, or I can do this on his eye, the eyes layer itself. So maybe on his eyes layer, I'm going to stay on the black. I'm going to take my opacity down to 5%. And I'm just going to put some shadows around his eyes just to give him a bit of depth. Now what this means is that when I change the eyes out, maybe if I give him different eyes at a later stage, those shadows aren't attached to the head itself, which allows us to change out the eyes and mouth without it leaving behind any residual patterns in case the other eyes were to be a bit narrower. So let's, for example, just quickly create another set of eyes and mouth. So I'm back on 100% opacity, and I'm going to go to white, and I'm going to give this guy a little smile. Now his eyes this time, let's maybe make them a little bit narrower. And we'll give him some shifty eyes. And now on top of that, we can add another opacity layer on the same layer. Let's rename this layer Smile and Thin Eyes. And now on the smile and thin eyes, let's turn our opacity down to 5%. And let's do the same thing and put a little bit of a shadow around his eyes. Now by keeping these shadows on his eyes, each time when we change between our two sets of eyes, it's not leaving behind a different shadow that interacts with our previous set and might cause some issues. So now when I'm zooming in and out, I'm pressing Command minus and Command plus just to give myself a nice perspective of what he looks like a little bit further away and a little bit closer. So One of the things about constructive editing is if we were to perhaps not like the shadow layer we've put on him and want to change it or decrease or increase its opacity, it's as simple as choosing our opacity shadows or our solid shadows. So we'll choose opacity shadows, and maybe we want to turn them down a bit, in which case we can go here to the opacity layer and we can turn those shadows down. And as we bring them down, you'll see our shadows decreasing. And if we wanted to take those shadows up above 100%, we could always take this opacity shadows layer, drag it onto the add layers button, and it'll create a copy of that. And by creating a copy, it's doubling up on our opacity shadows. As you can see, I'm going to turn this layer on and off, and this is our doubled up shadows, which actually don't look too bad at all. So maybe we'll leave those on just for the added depth. Okay, next thing I'm going to show you is just a quick example of destructive editing. So instead of drawing each element on a completely new layer, we could be working all on one layer. I'm going to select all of our layers quickly. I'm going to press Control E, which merges our layers together. And now we have all of these things on one layer on the side here, and we can turn this single layer on and off. Now, what this means is that if there's any element we don't particularly like, and we try to erase it using our eraser tool, you'll see that by taking away that element, we actually take away everything on that layer, which isn't the most beneficial when it comes to editing. It also means that our individual elements, like our eyes, like our mouth, like our shadows, they can't be saved individually and used as assets and algorithmically replaced. So it's always beneficial to work in layers when you're dealing with character generation on an algorithmic scale. Obviously, this varies from program to program, but in Photoshop, it's ideal to keep these layers separate. So let's Control Z, and let's go back to the point that we had all of our separate layers down here. Now, one thing as well that I'm going to show you quickly is just how we can convert our human to a few different varying skin tones. And we're going to do that using an adjustment layer. So the adjustment layers can be found in the window and adjustments. As you can see on the right-hand side here is my adjustments layer. And if I was to click on this, it'll automatically jump to here. Now the adjustment I want to add is I want to add an adjustment layer of hue and saturation. I don't want to add this adjustment to the shadows or the highlights specifically, because they're just light and darker colors that are affecting the color below it. We want to change the base color. So we're going to go down to base color. We're going to click on this here and make that our active layer. Now if we click on our adjustments, it's going to adjust that active layer. So now one thing I want to show you for an example, I'm just going to take this blue layer I have from earlier, and I'm just going to drag it all the way down to the bottom and put this above our base background. I want to use this as an example so that you can see when I change my hue and saturation, not only does it affect the human, it affects his background as well. And now one thing you'll notice is that it's changing everything except our solid colors. So our opacity shadows and our opacity highlights, they are dependent on the colors below them, and they are completely transparent and allow through the color below them, and that's why we get this effect here. However, our solid shadow is a solid color, and because that solid color is above our adjustment layer, it's almost immune to the adjustment layer. And by turning it off here, you can kind of see the effect it has, and we're turning it back on, we can see that. One thing we can do is we can drag our adjustment layer above this, and by dragging it above there, you'll see that it now includes that in the adjustment because it's below it. One thing we don't particularly want right now is we don't want this adjustment layer affecting all of our layers. We don't want it changing our background necessarily. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the mask function here. So as you can see, next to our adjustment layer, we've got a little white canvas. That white canvas acts as a mask in that anything we paint that is black on this white mask blocks out the adjustment layer coming through. As an example, I'm going to take out the brush and I'm going to put our brush on 100% opacity. It's on black. We're currently working on our adjustment layer, so anywhere we now draw with black, it's going to block out that particular adjustment. So let me quickly set this adjustment to something extreme like purple, and we'll click here on our little mask layer, and anywhere we draw black, you'll see it blocks out the adjustment itself. So what we're looking to do here is we're looking to block out everything but our human. We want our human to be adjusted, but we do not want to adjust our background specifically. So how are we going to do that? Is just quickly undo that messy work we just did. And in order to create a nice clean screen around this, we're going to select our previous layers, like our base layer down here and our outline layer. We're going to use them to create the mask itself. So by holding down Command and clicking on any particular layer, it selects all the pixels in that layer. Right now that was our base color. As you can see, it's selected everything but not our outlines. In order to add our outlines, we hold down Command and hold down Shift and then click on our outlines as well. As you can see, while I'm holding down Command and Shift and hovering over the outlines, we've got a little plus symbol that's appearing. As I let go of Shift, the plus symbol disappears, and as I hold Shift, the plus symbol reappears. So I'm going to click on there, and as you can see, our marching ants have now included that layer's pixels as well. Okay, so now we have our entire human selected, and you can tell by the marching ants. And we're going to go into our layers, our adjustment layer here, and let's take out our paint bucket tool. By pressing G, I brought up the paint bucket, and now anywhere I click is going to get filled up by this paint bucket. So because we have our human selected, as I click, it's going to completely mask off the zone where our human is and prevent him from being affected by the adjustment layer. We want the complete inverse of this. So what we're going to do is just go back one step, and in order to invert this selection, we're going to press Apple Shift I. And by pressing Apple Shift I, we're going to invert that selection. Another way to do this is to head over to your Select panel, or maybe it's your Layer panel. And over here, you've got Inverse, which is Shift Command I. So now once you've got that selection inversed, you'll see your marching ants have now moved to your outside border and your human, meaning that now if you click, as you can see down at the bottom, the mask we've created is everything but our human, and that's where our adjustment's shining through. By pressing Command D, we deselect that selection, and we can move over back to our adjustment layer. Now on our adjustment layer, we can take our hue back to 0 because we're not really looking to change the hue of our human right now. We're looking to change his lightness. And we're just going to take his lightness down a bit and give him a bit of a tan skin tone. Now as you can see, as we decrease his skin tone to being a little bit more tanned, or maybe even a little bit darker, you can see our highlight layer is a little bit more extreme than we'd like it to be. Now, one of the benefits of constructive editing is that we can specifically adjust that highlights layer. So I'm going to go over to our opacity highlights layer. I'm going to click on it, and I'm going to take the opacity of the specific layer down a bit. And there we've taken it to a slightly more subtle level. So that's our first few steps complete, and we have our nice base human with some tones, with some shading. And we'll select this human from his base color all the way up to his eyes. Maybe let's leave his eyes out. Now we have all the elements that make up this base human, from his base color, his outlines, his adjustment layer, and his shadows. And we're going to press Ctrl G, and we're going to group that. And we're going to name this group base human. Okay, so our first asset we're going to create is we're going to create a pair of pants for this human here, because I think he deserves some pants. So let's start a new layer. Let's call that layer base pants color, and we can choose any color we want. So I tend to choose a relatively mid-range color, nothing too dark and nothing too light, only because adjustment layers work best when we have a color with relatively high saturation, relatively in the middle of our light-dark range. So let's put on a classic pair of blue pants. So we'll choose a pair of blue pants for our human. And we're going to go to our brush, 100% opacity, and we're going to draw some blue pants on our human. Now that we've got those blue pants, we can go through the same process and we can create an opacity shadow layer. We can press D, go to default colors, our brush, 10% opacity, and we can start to draw in a few shadows. I'm going to take my opacity up to 20% just to get a bit of a quicker effect. Okay, now maybe I want one or two quick highlights, and I'll create the same thing. I'll create an opacity highlights layer. I'll switch to white by pressing X. I'll take my opacity down to 10%, and I'll put one or two highlights in the pants here, just to give us a bit of texture. Okay. Now that we have our pants, we can go through the same process, take our pants color, go to our adjustments layer, and now we can work with the hue and saturation, because we actually want to change color now and not just lightness and darkness. So one of the things you'll notice again is as we change our hue and saturation, it's going to affect everything on any layer below that function. So now we're going to go about a different way of getting it to affect only these pants. And instead of creating a mask, we're going to choose the color we want. We're going to change it to some reddish pants. And by holding down Alt and moving our cursor between two layers, we see the cursor change to this little stepped icon. And by clicking the stepped icon, it makes the adjustment layer step into the layer below it, which means now this adjustment layer only affects this layer below it. We can turn this on and off, and we can see it's only affecting this bottom layer. If we turn this bottom layer off, this layer goes with it. So now we have nice control over that specific area. Now one thing we can do again is we can choose everything that's involved with these pants. We can group them, and we can save these as pants. Next thing we'll move on to is creating a new layer and doing some hair. Now that we're on this hair layer, let's choose a nice poppy color. Let's go with some bright green, and let's give this guy a little bit of hair. Okay, now that he's got some hair, What we should do is we should move to a new layer to do the outline for this hair, but instead we're going to intentionally do this on the same layer so that I can show you a technique. So we're going to switch to our black brush by pressing default and going to black, and we'll outline this hair quickly. Now, in most scenarios, when you use a adjustment layer and you change the hue of something and you have a black outline, it's not going to create any problems for you because black is kind of safe from a hue alteration. And I'll show you now if we were to use a hue adjustment on this layer, we can kind of adjust the hue as much as we want, and the black will stay solid black. But for the purposes of what we're about to do, you'll see how that's a bit of a problem. So now our next step is we're gonna just remove this adjustment layer, and I want to show you how to move this black outline onto a new layer. And instead of deleting it using the eraser tool, we're instead going to use the select function here, and we're going to select a color range. When you select a color range, each color you click on will get selected throughout the entire document. And as you can see here, we have a variety of colors on his skin tone, and as you select it, it only selects that exact same color. If you were to go here on your color range panel and adjust your fuzziness to a higher value, something like 80, when you select a color, it's going to select far more of that color range as opposed to just the specific color. It'll select the colors around it, above and below it, hue and saturation, that tend to kind of fit into the range that you've applied in fuzziness, which is quite convenient. For the time being, though, we're looking to select the exact same color. We're going to put fuzziness on 0. We're going to select the black outline, and it's going to select all the black in the entire drawing. How do we want to view this? We want to view this as a quick mask, which shows us over here. And as we click OK, it's going to create marching ants around all the black in the drawing. Right now, our working layer is on our hair color base. So this is only going to affect the hair color base. So as I press Control X and I cut, it's removed the black only from that layer. So now in order to put it on a new layer, as we paste, it'll automatically create a new layer. And if we were to press Control V and paste, you'll see it pastes it right in the middle of the screen. By pressing V, we'll move over to the Move tool, and using the Move tool, we can drag this layer into place. Another alternative is when pasting, you can press Command Shift V and use Paste in Place. Paste in Place pastes it exactly where you removed it from and is a very convenient function. So now the next thing we want to do is we want to add some texture to this hair. Say it's very curly hair. Something I like to use is the Noise tool. The Noise tool is a destructive tool, which means that it permanently affects the layer you're working on. Not always do I tend to use destructive tools. Sometimes it can't be avoided. There is no adjustment for noise. Noise is a filter, and that filter applies to your layer and gets merged into it. So we're going to click on our hair color base down here. Let's just rename hair outlines. And in our hair color base, we're going to click filter, and we're going to go to noise, and we're going to go to add noise. And as you can see, when we've gone into add noise, it's added some noise to that layer. We can increase or decrease the amount of noise, and we can find a nice range we're happy with. I'm thinking something around the 12% mark. You get uniform noise and Gaussian noise. Uniform noise just means you have less outliers and the noise itself is far more even, as you can see, and Gaussian noise just gives you a bit more don't know, a bit more wildness in there. You can go monochromatic, or if you go non-monochromatic, as your noise increases, so does the color variety that comes out in the noise. I very seldom use non-monochromatic noise. I tend to always use monochromatic noise, just as it suits what we're doing right now. So now that we've added that noise, we can click OK, and that noise has been permanently applied to our hair base color. And one thing I want to show you about us moving our hair outlines to another layer is that if we were to have left our hair outlines on that layer, and I'm going to show you quickly over here by pressing Control E, it's going to merge, Command E, it's going to merge that outlines layer back into our hair layer. So our hair and outlines are now as one again, and I'm just going to reapply that same noise filter. And as you can see, as we increase our noise, the noise also affects our outline. And that's not really beneficial for what we're trying to achieve. We want the noise in the hair. We want a nice clean outline. So for us, it's beneficial here to have the noise only affecting our hair color layer. So I'm just going to Control Z, bring back our separate layers, go to our hair layer, and I'm going to add that noise at the 12% we had earlier. Now that we got that bit of noise in the hair, we can move on to adding some opacity shadows. Now that we have opacity shadows, we'll go through our same process as before, and we're going to go black, take our opacity down to 10%, and now if we were to draw inside of this hair here, we have the ability, as you can see, to go outside of the hair. One nice thing I like to do in order to keep my working nice and clean, I like to hold down Command, click on my hair base color layer. It'll select that layer, but now my working layer is still the opacity shadows, and what this allows is that it doesn't let me draw anywhere outside of this range. It keeps my work limited to this little selection area, which lets you work a little bit faster and a little bit messier without the risk of doing any damage to the outside and having to clean it up afterwards. So now that I'm on opacity shadows and on 10%, I'm just going to add a bit of detail to this hair. Now once again, because we're using an opacity layer, each time we let go of our mouse and then go over it again for the second time or third time, it adds to the darkness, creating a little bit more variety in color. So I'm just going to keep going over certain areas, get a bit of texture, and then maybe add quite a lot of darkness towards the back of his head, just to get us a nice 3D look. Okay, now I've got that opacity shadow applied. I can press Command D, deselect that layer, and I'll just turn this on and off quickly so you can get an example of the depth we've added. Something else I'd like to do is to ground this hair so it looks like it's sitting on him. We'd like a shadow underneath the hair, for example. So we're going to zoom in here, and we're just going to add some shadows around the edge of the hair, just so that it looks like it's sitting on his head. And once again, as you can see, each time we click on the same area, it multiplies the amount of shadow we have on there. Now we've got a slightly more grounded hair, and we can group this hair so that all the layers that create this hair, Control G, and now we've got a group that we'll call hair, and we'll call this hair green. Now, once again, just like with the pants and changing their color with an adjustment layer, we're going to do the same, and we're going to drag hair. We're going to drag it to the plus, and we're going to name this hair blue. Let's turn hair green off. And you'll notice that now that we have hair blue and hair green, they both have shadows that are overlapping, and those shadows have now gone darker. You'll see as I turn one of them off, our shadows are increasing and decreasing, because even though our solid color hair is hiding each other, the shadows themselves are an alpha channel that have transparency, so they interact and double up when they're on top of each other. So we're just going to turn off our second layer of hair. We want to make this hair blue, so we're going to open it up. We're going to go to our color base, an adjustment, hue adjustment, and we're going to change this to blue. And once again, we're going to hold down Options or Alt, and we're going to click between layers so it only applies to that specific layer. Now we have one blue hair option and one green hair option. And same goes for our pants. We have our pants with their hue saturation, and we have pants red. And we'll drag this here, multiply that layer, and we'll name this pants. Let's say pants yellow. And we'll go turn off the other pants layer, and in here we'll go into our adjustment and we'll find a nice yellow. And as you can see, the only yellow we have is quite dark, so we can go into the lightness here and we can turn this up a bit. As we turn this up, you can see they go a bit faded and we're losing our saturation. So the middle bar here, we can push our saturation up and bring that yellow back and get him some nice bright yellow pants. Okay, and now we can close that, and we've got our yellow pants and our red pants, our blue hair and our green hair. Let's put some blue hair on him. Okay, let's add a shirt, and with the shirts I'll show you one or two other techniques. So let's call this shirt base color, and we'll zoom in and we'll add a shirt to this little guy. Let's start off with a color like let's go with a nice pink. And we're going to go brush 100% opacity, and we're just going to draw a little bit of a shirt on this human. We're going to give him an open shirt because he's feeling casual. And let's take the shirt so it overlaps onto our pants, just so we can use that as an example later to our layering. Okay, now that we have our base color, what we're going to do is we're going to make this into a Hawaiian shirt. And as a Hawaiian shirt, maybe we want some patterns on there. So we're going to create a new layer, and we'll call that pattern flowers. Okay, now for the flowers, we'll choose one or two colors that stand out against the pink. Maybe let's choose we'll choose a red, and we'll put a few red dots in there. And let's add another color, and we'll choose green. Let's put a few green dots in there. Okay, now that we have our flowers layer with our dots, they're looking a bit hard. They're quite a harsh color with quite sharp edges, and maybe we'd like to soften that up and make it look like those flowers a bit more natural, a bit more overlapping. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a blur to these flowers, and we're going to go to the filter layer again, and we're going to go blur. Once again, I quite like Gaussian, so I'm going to choose Gaussian. All these options are pretty standard and they're fun to play around with. If you want to try them out, just click on each one, give them a go, and if you don't like them, just undo. So we'll go to our Gaussian blur, and because we're working on such a low pixel density, something as little as 0.6 pixels is going to have a large impact. So let's take that down to 0.2, not too much, 0.3, yeah, 0.3 is looking a bit closer to what we want. And 0.4, yeah, 0.4 is looking not too bad, although as you can see, we've lost some of the intensity of our color, and we're going to fix that in a second. So let's choose that, okay. And right now, as you can see, quite a lot of our colors where they've blurred have blurred outside the lines of our t-shirt. So for the sake of example, and to let you see a bit clearer, I'm going to take these flowers, I'm going to drag them and double them up and then merge them down again. And now I've doubled the intensity of that layer, and in doing so you can see our colors are a little bit brighter. And so is the overlap we've created. Some of this overlap are on our black line, some are on our human, some are outside of our human. And what we want to do is delete everything that's not over the shirt. So how do we do that? Is that we go to our shirt base color layer, we hold down Command and we click on it. And in order to delete everything outside of it, we're going to once again invert our selection, Command Shift I, and you'll see our marching ants have now moved around to the border of our image. And when we press backspace, it's going to delete everything around that. Just going to go back so you can see the effect, and back again so you can see what we've done there. And now we have our shirt with a little bit of blur around it, creating some added detail. And we've got our little Hawaiian shirt. Next thing is to go through the next step of our process that we've been through a few times now, and we're just going to add some opacity shadows just to create some depth to this item. We're going to go brush, and we're going to take it down to 10% or maybe 20% actually. So let's give this guy a little bit of shadow here. 20% was a bit high. I'm going to go back to 10%. We can always double up where we need to. So, first thing I did there was add some shadow underneath his t-shirt, and technically that's shadow that goes outside of the lines, that when we save this asset, not only is it going to have shadows on top of it, it'll have some shadows spilling off the asset. And the beauty of PNG files is that they have an alpha channel, and they allow us to save something like a transparency without it becoming a flat color. So when we overlay this asset on top of something else, anything underneath it will be affected by the transparency that it has. I'll give you an example of that as we move forward and move on to exporting. But just before we move on, let's put some shadows on top of this actual shirt. Once again, like we did with the hair, we're just grounding this shirt by putting some slightly darker shadows around the edges of it so that it interacts nicely with the item below it. Okay, so now that we've got our shirt sorted, we can do the same thing as we did before, and we can create some variety in colors with this shirt. So first thing we'll do is we'll select all the layers that make up the shirt, we'll group them, and we'll name them Hawaiian shirt. That Hawaiian shirt will copy, and as we copy, you'll see once again we've doubled up on our shadows, and by turning off our previous layer, you'll see our shadows getting more and less intense as we turn this layer on and off. So we'll go into our new Hawaiian shirt, we'll name this Hawaiian shirt 2, and in Hawaiian shirt 2 we'll create an adjustment layer. We want to create that adjustment layer on top of both the flowers and the shirt base color. And as you can see, as we change this, it's going to change everything in our entire drawing, whereas we only want it to affect the shirt. So we're going to select the shirt by pressing Command and clicking on our layer here. We're then going to inverse our selection. We're going to go to our paint bucket tool by pressing G, and we're going to drop black into everywhere on the image. And as you can see down here, it's created a nice little mask for us. And now anything we change is only going to change the shirt itself. And I'm digging those colors there. So we're going to leave him with that. So we can close that, and there's Hawaiian shirt too. Now, one of the last things I'm going to show you here is I'm going to explain to you how we export these layers or these layer groups and turn them into assets themselves so that we can pass them on to someone to use algorithmically to generate our variety of characters. So first things first, let's create 3 bases we can work with. So 3 base humans. So we've already got our 1 base human, which is, I'm going to turn off these other layers. We've got our base human that we can call base human tan. And let's copy this base human, turn off the previous one, and we can make him a bit lighter. And let's call him base human light. And let's do that same process again. And let's take this darkness down. And let's call this base human dark. So now we have 3 different bases we have to deal with, and we can save those as our 3 options for now. So one thing we want to do is we want to keep our editability going and keep ourselves a working document. So instead of flattening these groups themselves into assets or for our PNGs, we can copy them first. And now that they're copied, we can go to each group individually and press Control E. Control E is the merge function, and it'll merge everything within that group. So with just one of these layers on, we can press Control E and merge. And as you see, as I did that, it's merged all of this into our 1 human that can be moved around. And as you can see, he is separate from his eyes and mouth. We're going to do the same thing for our other bases. We're going to use the merge function. And once again, we're going to use the merge function. Now what we've got here is we have our three bases. Now what we can do is we can export those 3 bases separately, and we'll have 3 PNG files from which we can start to assemble stuff on. So let's move these up to the top of our document just by dragging them up. And we're going to put them just above our eyes and our mouths. And let's turn these off. And we'll turn on one of our other bottom bases just as an example while we keep moving. So our pants red, we're going to want to take all these assets from pants to hair to Hawaiian shirt. We can drag them onto copy, and one by one we can merge them. Now we have completely flattened layers of each of these assets. And as you can see, these shirts, they have an alpha channel of transparency that's going to come with them. That's going to affect anything that's underneath them. The pants as well. And the hair are all solid individual assets now. We're going to move those assets up with the rest of our items. And as you can see, if I turn these off and say I turn on hair, a Hawaiian shirt, and some pants, if we change the order of these assets and put our pants above our shirt, we're going to lose that overlap we originally had. And that's going to create some issues for our generative coding when it comes around to it. So it's a good point to now take note of which assets are in what layers, maybe name them accordingly, or just make notes on an Excel spreadsheet in order to give it to your little code monkey who's going to be doing the generative assembly for you. Okay, so now that we have this group of assets, we're going to want to export these assets, and we're going to want to export them as PNG files. So I quickly want to show you an example of one of the problems with exporting assets sometimes, is that if you were to take this hair, for example, and you were to click on these 3 lines up here in your layer panel, and you can export this layer and only the layer. And when you export this layer, it is exporting all the pixels that exist inside of that layer, but it is exporting them to a bounding box that is limited to where those pixels exist. Now, the problem with this is that we want to overlay this onto a 64 by 64 image. And if we're giving this to someone to do generatively and algorithmically, the problem is that how do they know where to align this 22 pixel by 18 pixel image? And that's going to be a large problem for us because each item is going to be aligned differently, and we really want them to just fit layer by layer by layer on top of them. And one of the ways we solve this problem is by giving us this layer a mask in itself. And by adding a mask to these layers, down here is our mask function, and by adding just a simple blank mask, we solve that problem. And that means when we save our PNGs, they get saved with an alpha channel the same size as the canvas we're working on. Right now, Photoshop, this is the latest Photoshop, and they've yet to solve this issue. There have been a lot of people complaining in the forums. Previous Photoshop editions, once you added this mask and you went to export, it would create that box for you. Right now, we're still stuck with this previous box, but what we did should have saved that problem, and that hopefully will be rectified soon. But instead, I'll show you as an example. I'm going to turn off all the other layers. Instead, you should be looking at something like this. This is how you want to be saving your assets. You want to be saving your assets so that they get put onto a 64 by 64 pixel canvas and that they are perfectly aligned, so that each time you overlay those assets, they're perfectly in place. How do we want to save these? We want to save them as a PNG. PNG is the best for pixel art. It just handles flat colors very well. It scales very well. And it also has a fantastic alpha channel that deals with the transparency. So right now with our transparency off, you can see it adds a white background, and those pixels here can't be overlaid over anything else. But with the transparency layer, this is ready to use as a combination asset. And we could save this as is. One of the things that's very important with pixel art is that every time you do any kind of resampling, you want to have it on nearest neighbor as opposed to bicubic. I'm going to give you a nice demonstration on why bicubic is not a positive thing for pixel art, and I'll show you how nearest neighbor is a nice convenient thing to be using. So let's bring back some of our layers, and let's give our human some eyes. Right now our eyes are below all our other assets, and we're just going to move them up. One of the ways we can move layers up and down is holding Command and open and closed bracket. The same function applies for making the cursor bigger and smaller when you're on the brush tool. So by pressing B, we go to our brush tool, and without holding down Command, if you just use open and close bracket, you increase and decrease the size of your cursor. That's a nice convenient shortcut. Okay, I'll quickly show you the pros and cons of, well, mostly just the pros of nearest neighbor. So I'm going to take the few visible layers we have. I'm just quickly going to merge them together for the sake of an example. So now we have them all merged into one layer. And I'm going to just quickly upscale this image for you. I'm going to crop his head. Okay, right now, as we can see, his eyes are 2 pixels across. And if we were to increase this image by 50%, then those eyes will be 3 pixels across. But right now, they are 50% black and 50% white. And if we were to increase the size of this image, that 3 pixels will then represent his eyes. How would you make it half black and half white when there are only 3 pixels to work with? You can't make half a pixel black and half a pixel white. So for example, if I press Ctrl T, which is transform, and I want to make this image 50% bigger, over here I've selected 150, you can see the problem we've got is that Photoshop has had to decide which one it is going to choose to give preference to on those 2 of 3. So basically our eyes, which were once 2 pixels across, are now 3 pixels across. They were once half black and half white, only now they are 66% black and 33% white. You can also see a lot of the shapes around the hair have been distorted. And this is what happens when you upscale pixel art in a way that isn't a perfect square. You always need to realize that there are only so many pixels available, and when you're moving something like 2 pixels into a gap that is something like 7 pixels large, you're asking Photoshop to make some decisions for you. Now, as I press the tick, we're going to get some issues. If we have our interpolation or our resampling on bicubic automatic, which is what it's set to by default, if we have this on, you'll see something like this happening. Now, while this hazy resampling or interpolation is convenient for higher resolution images, it really causes big issues for pixel art. So when resizing pixel art, one of the things you want to do is always have it on nearest neighbor. And the other thing you want to do is you want to always make sure you increase your size by perfect squares. So up here you can see we're on 100%, and by going to 150 we get some issues. But at 200, no issues. At 250 we see some problems again. Once again you can see the eyes here now 3 pixels across, and it's chosen to give the preference to the white pixels. Doesn't look as prevalent around the hair, but it'll create a big problem at a later stage. So at 200, 300, 400, you don't see any problems. It's only when you start to go outside of the perfect square ratio that you're going to get some issues with the resizing. And it's a good example of pixel art scaling and a simple rule you're going to need to follow. So if you're going to want to output this image at a large format, the higher your resampling amount gets, the more forgiving it is. So right now we're at 64 pixels. So if you want to upscale this to fill a 600 by 900 pixel screen, you've got a lot of wiggle room to play with, because in that 600 to 900 pixel ratio, you can find a pretty close relationship that the 64 will fit into. Whereas if you're just going to be doubling or tripling the size, you're going to have to be a lot more careful. And yeah, that's pretty much it for this little pixel tutorial. I'll make sure to put out some more and get a little bit more in depth with creating some frame animations. As you can see down here, it's already set up to do so, and I'll do that shortly for you guys. Once again, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me, and thanks for spending the time watching this.